and start discussing today's topic, which is who shapes the ethical city. Actually, who shapes cities in general. And can you all see those slides? Yep, all good. So actually, I took this picture. You probably don't know where it is. It's in London, a place called Brick Lane. But I really loved the graffiti there, and I thought it was quite artistically done. And I kind of like the underbelly of cities, you know, the fact that not all cities are nice and squeaky clean. I like the fact that people try to impose their identity on the city. So anyway, I couldn't resist taking this picture. So just to remind everybody where we are in progress so far, we're at the session 3, and next week we'll have our first guest speaker, who is Professor John Fain from RMIT University in Australia, and he's going to be talking about a very important notion, which is the right to the city. So I'm really looking forward to his talk. It's a really interesting perspective. And today we're thinking about the potential of ethical cities and how do we expand that potential. So there are maybe 3 things to think about. Firstly, can we use the ethical city to counter regressive city trends? And then I want you to actually have a discussion about what you think those regressive city trends are. And then is it possible to advance alternative ideas and approaches to the city that maybe reshape the city agenda in a more ethical direction? And then finally, is it possible to change the future of city development somehow? And I'm really very interested to hear your ideas on whether you think it might be possible, because it's very, very important, I think, what your generation thinks about these problems, especially since we're in a situation where housing in many cities is going to be 7 times your salary, whereas maybe 30 years ago it was only 3 times somebody's average salary. So there's lots of really big issues that need to be solved to make city living comfortable for you. So one of the arguments put forward by a number of scholars around urban ethics and ethical cities is actually this desire for a more ethical approach to urbanism is a consequence of neoliberalism. It's a consequence of a gap that has been left by the shrinking state, by the actual local governments, for instance, becoming smaller and less capable of doing things. And also, there is a potential that ethical cities are about subverting, undermining neoliberalism. So there's 2 sides of the same coin. And again, this would be something that'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on. So just now, can anybody provide a definition of neoliberalism? And I think I'll stop sharing here just to see if anybody, because it's actually quite a complicated idea. And for a long time when I was living in Japan, I didn't come across this idea very frequently. But when I moved to Australia, it seemed like all the academics were talking about neoliberalism. And it seemed that like all the problems that we have in the world today were somehow related to neoliberalism, according to those academics. So I just wondered if anybody might volunteer to give a definition of neoliberalism. Anybody? You can raise your hand. Don't be shy. I'm looking for, okay, I'll call on somebody then. It's not fair just to pick on people who have their cameras on. So Alex, can you maybe give us a some idea of what you think neoliberalism is?
Hello.
Hello.
I'm not really familiar with this idea, but uh, no, I'm really not familiar with this idea. I think liberalism is like somehow related with the economic way you could visualize your society.
Right.
But neoliberalism, I don't I don't really like know what could be like new on this perspective. So no, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Um, I guess it might also be something you maybe use a different term in French. I'm not sure.
Maybe
No, I
yeah.
think we used the same one, but even I don't know how much I can add to what Alexis said because I'm not familiar either with the term, but I think it's, and at least in French, when we refer to neoliberalism, it's more, for example, breaking the borders between countries and facilitating trade and facilitating, the different economic transfers between countries. And I think, and it's more of a political like it's a political idea, so it's countries that adopt or don't adopt neoliberalism. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yep. So it's like free trade. The notion of free trade, anti-protectionism is one aspect of neoliberalism. That's correct. Anybody else got an? And let's say that it's actually been around, although it's called neoliberalism, it's actually been around for quite some time and became quite influential towards the end of the 1970s. Anyone else would like to comment? Anybody from a political science background? It is a political science term. Um, Anyone? Okay, Wanshi, could you please?
So maybe like less government intervention in the like local economies.
Yes,
Yeah.
so it's basically the notion that um, we should reduce the size of government, not just locally, but also nationally, and reduce the amount of money that we are spending on government, because government is actually seen as being a kind of drain on the economy rather than actually promoting sort of economic development. So that's small government is part of the idea behind neoliberalism. Okay, good. That gives us an initial idea, and I've got a little video that explains it further. So that there are some very influential thinkers behind it. As you can see here, Friedrich Hayek was one of the first ones to come up with this political philosophy. And then the economist Milton Friedman is perhaps best well known for taking it into a sort of policy perspective. But let me share this video, which explains neoliberalism fairly concisely.
What is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is a policy model that encompasses both politics and economics and seeks to transfer the control of economic factors from the public sector to the private sector. Many neoliberalism policies enhance the workings of free market capitalism and attempt to place limits on government spending, government regulation, and public ownership. Hence, the policies of neoliberalism typically support fiscal austerity, deregulation, free trade, privatization, and a reduction in government spending. Neoliberalism is often associated with the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK from 1979 to 1990, and Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the US, from 1981 to 1989. More recently, neoliberalism has been associated with policies of austerity and attempts to cut government spending on social programs. Neoliberalism is related to laissez-faire economics, a school of thought that prescribes a minimal amount of government interference into the economic issues of individuals and society. Laissez-faire economics proposes that continued economic growth will lead to technological innovation, expansion of the free market, and limited state interference. Scholars always distinguish neoliberalism from liberalism. While liberalism is based on the moral argument that ensuring the right of an individual person to life, liberty, and property is the highest goal of government, neoliberalism is more narrowly focused, as it is primarily concerned with the market and the policies and measures that influence the economy.
Cool. Okay, I hope that's clear. Anthony Giddens, who's one of the leading political economist commentators from the UK, he describes neoliberalism as follows. It's minimal government, market fundamentalism, so a market above everything else, economic individualism, and then acceptance of inequality. There's always going to be winners and losers. Traditional nationalism. So really, although it is free trade, it's essentially you want your country to benefit the most from any trade arrangements. The welfare state is seen as a safety net to try to capture those people who are not able to benefit from the economy. It's linear modernization, so it just assumes that things are going to continue to get better and better, to continue to modernize. And it has very low ecological consciousness, although actually Margaret Thatcher was very much aware and supportive of doing something related to global warming. And then it's described as a realist theory of international order. So those are the main criteria. And there's actually been quite a lot written about what the impact that neoliberalism has had on our cities, whether that's sort of smaller local government, reducing the financial resources of local government, and also there's actually been a lot of resistance to the neoliberal city. So what I want to ask you to do is to think a little bit about what neoliberalism has been doing or impacts it has on our cities. So we're going to go into breakout groups now for 15 minutes or so. And I want you to talk about your city, your hometown or your university town, and whether you think there are any regressive trends that you could tie up to this definition of the neoliberal city, and also if there's any positive trends to think about that. But if there are regressive trends, how do you think they relate to neoliberalism? So let me stop sharing. Are you do you understand that, what I'm asking you to do? So that maybe in some places, for instance, in Japan, we don't hear much about neoliberalism at all. So you might struggle a little bit to come up with a good, clear description. But I think of those regressive trends. But just try to think a little bit about what you see as you walk around your city, and whether you think that relates to neoliberalism. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, Eunice.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I am in the
A
same
bit
class.
echoey.
Yeah, I'm in the same class as some other people. Thank you. Okay, so I'm not very sure what does it mean by regressive trends and positive trends. Like what counts as a regressive trend and what counts as a positive trend?
Okay, so the positive trends essentially would be if you think that focusing only on economic development for your city is bringing out good results, and what those good results will be. Or if, for instance, privatization is happening in your city, is that bringing about some positive impacts? Then the negative side would be, well, if we're making local government and government smaller, and we're cutting services, and we're promoting austerity, what kind of negative consequences happen as a result of that? Is that clear? Okay. Anyone else got any questions? And it's essentially a little bit about thinking about your hometown and what have you seen that has changed over the last couple of decades, and can you tie that into neoliberalism in some way? Okay. So I'm gonna automatically assign you. I'm gonna make 3 groups, and I'd also like you to have somebody who's nominated to report back after the group discussion. Okay. So again, just talk about your own experience and what you observe. If it's looking around Osaka, if it's things you've seen in Japan, you can share that. But if it's relating to your hometown and city, that would be great. Okay. So let me try to create the groups. Right, we've got them, and I'm gonna open all rooms. So please join for 15 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So if you selected somebody to report back, can that person raise their hand, and I'll call. I mean, raise their hand in the reactions there, and I'll call on the person to just brief everybody on what you discussed. Nobody gonna raise their hands? You know how to click on the reaction there, and are they okay? Yuri, please. Thank you. Great.
Um, yeah, my group talked about several things, but I think one that was like pretty common was the housing crisis in Germany, Vancouver and Sydney, and how like lower and like middle class people are like having trouble affording rent or like buying real estate, I guess. And like I'm not sure like the details of like what goes on in Vancouver's real estate sector, but like I know like years back I heard news about like foreign investments and how that's also like playing a role in like yeah, that whole thing. And also our group talked also about the healthcare systems and how in Germany and Sydney there's like both public and private, and because public there's a lot more wait times and all that, like I guess it creates like an inequality where people who are more wealthy and well off kind of choose the private sector, whereas lower income people would choose the public sector. And yeah, I think that was the gist of what we talked about.
Great. So the 2 areas were health and housing. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. That's excellent. Alexis?
Hello. So for our group, we talked about like maybe 3 major problems I could think of. First was low like ecological consideration when events like Olympic Games or sports events abroad. Like everything is made for uh, like building those facilities and making space uh, in despite the life of inhabitants there. So we had an example in the Marshall cities where they bombed part of the ocean to make more space. But also just thought of the example of Paris, who's like expulsing and pushing away students who live in social housing to welcome like foreigners for the Olympic Games in August. So this is like really neoliberalism, like only thinking about profit and not thinking of people living there. We also talked about like how neoliberalism is linked to only thinking more about the person and yourself, the individual, and maybe less thinking about the disabled people. So it's hard for it's if it's already hard for you, and like if your like city administration don't do anything to push you for going like to facility more easily, those people are not going to go out, and uh it may like a circle, like snowball effect. They will not want to go out in less facility, and so this is bad. And we could also think maybe of like homeless people in like Osaka, like the homeless people like policies, how they deal with those people. And I think in Osaka and maybe more in Japan, they push them away from the city center, which I think is not a solution. And lastly, we talked also about public transportation, and some people in our group thought maybe privatization of public transportation is not a good thing. And we also talked a bit about gentrification, how gentrification and how some policies that were not directly related to gentrification, such as like improvement of public transportation or improvement of life there, could lead to pushing away some inhabitants and rising up the prices of inhabitations. So that's what we talked about.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I'm glad you brought up the example of the Olympics, especially the Olympics every year, every 4 years just seems to get more and more expensive. And it's actually quite extraordinary how much a city needs to pay to host the Olympics. And many cities go into debt to host the Olympics. So will it be interesting to see how Paris works? And we're talking about multiple $billion euro investments there, but it's unclear of what the benefits are for the people who live in Paris. Similar when there was the London Olympics and so on. And what's quite interesting is that recently in Australia, and I don't know if you know this, but the Victoria government basically indicated that it was not going to support the Commonwealth Games. It was going to give up hosting the Commonwealth Games because it couldn't afford it, and it couldn't see the economic benefits of doing these major sporting events. But it's interesting because cities compete to host these big sporting events, and maybe their citizens are not really happy about it. Similar problems are occurring with the Winter Olympics as well. So they're quite interesting how this competition works between cities. Wang Shi, Mimi, do you want to say what your group talked about?
No, I was in the same group as
Oh,
Alexa,
okay.
but I just wanted to add a little bit, if that's okay.
Sure.
Because the example came up because I'm from the Marshall Islands, which is in the Pacific, and they're hosting the Micro Olympics, which is part of the region. So I thought it would be especially detrimental because we're also vulnerable to climate change. So I just feel like because of neoliberalism or wanting to host the Micro Olympics, so like he said, they had to put TNT into the oceans to like explode the land so they could build the track and field. And so that itself is like pretty detrimental to the biodiversity as well. And I guess putting money into building infrastructures for the Micro Olympics also like takes away money that they're probably supposed to be using to contribute to mitigating climate change. So yeah, I just thought that was, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think that as societies, it is a little bit easier for us to invest in like a big infrastructure project than it is to say spread the money around more people so that they benefit from it. So we tend to like those big projects, but then also I think big companies like those projects as well. So we're sort of tied into a model that's not necessarily working quite well, and probably we'll have to change it in the future. The third group, does anybody want to comment? Who was moderating? Israel, were you doing the moderation?
Sorry, yes, I was, but I'm having poor connection. So I'm worried to be the one to speak. But I think or Brendan or so another one of the other girls can maybe take my place and kind of recap what we talked about, which is education, transportation, and economic policies of each country.
Okay. Does anybody want to add something? Don't be quiet. Anyone from the group? Eunice, I saw you posted a comment about Singapore, and it sort of sounded like Singapore is pretty good, actually. They seem to take care of social welfare system seems okay. And you also mentioned that they invest in education and support students there. Whereas I think in many countries, you have to pay very high university fees and getting higher every year. Japan is actually quite reasonable, I
Yeah.
think.
And we talked, for example, about the difference in China, for instance. Apparently, most schools, I mean, from what I understood, are free or governmental schools. And so there are very few private schools except for the boarding schools. Whereas in other countries, such as Bahrain, for example, education is, not elitist, but although it's made for, although it's open for everyone, there is a huge gap between the education, the free governmental education, and the education of the higher class, the people that are paying for this education, the private schools. And I think similarly in Japan, I think it's closer maybe to China, and governmental schools are omnipresent in the country. We also spoke about the UK, I believe, that also has similar policies. So I think in this situation, Bahrain is the one that stood out the most, where there was a huge, marginalization and difference between governmental and private schools.
Right. Yeah. And I actually feel like let me just tell you my story. When I was growing up, my housing was provided by the city government. So we had what's called the social housing. So that was great for me. And then also school meals were provided, if you can believe that. And also, because I had to commute across the city, bus fares were covered. So I had school bus pass. So my commuting costs were covered by the city as well. And then when I went to university, I received a grant from the city. And the grant covered my living costs and my accommodation costs, and tuition was free. You probably can't believe that's the way it used to be. And at that time, it was actually affordable for the city to take on that responsibility. But now it's unimaginable. Now the cities cannot do such a thing. Yes, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I was in the same group. I'm sorry, they started construction 5 minutes ago, and then it's too loud to say. But that made me remind me of about China, where how in the 80s when college was just that, as what you said, everything was paid by the government. Everything was everything, including your living costs, transportation costs, and then also the tuition was all covered by the government. But I think recently the Chinese government and the country is moving towards more of a neoliberal side of education, where because college education is valued so much, that there's a lot of private universities that started to emerge in the country, and these universities can be super expensive. And under that site, I think for the best government welfare system in China, in the Chinese university, has been changing towards more privatized, and also making education harder to afford but more important in the country as well.
Right. Yeah. So we've got this really strange model now. Also because the government does, say for instance in Britain, the government does not want to pay much money to universities. So the universities are reliant on tuition fees. And then in order to actually cover the costs of operating the university, they have to attract more international students. And the international students have to pay twice the rate that the local students pay. I think even Australia is something similar to that. And so that education becomes a big commodity. And as a young person, if you want to go to university, in many instances, you have to accept that you're going to have a student debt. And then you're going to have to pay that off over a certain time period. That's kind of evolved. It's evolved into that. And I sort of feel like in many similar areas, we've just gradually evolved into this situation where having high debt is a reality. And also, I'm not sure that it's kind of hard to avoid it, because whether you talk about education or housing, you're going to be in debt at some stage. And so the idea that maybe you wouldn't have to have big debts, that you could probably at certain point in time, be able to afford a house, be able to afford the medical coverage, be able to afford a good education without getting into debt, that would be very nice. But unfortunately, that's not the direction that we're going in right now. And yeah, maybe we have to think a little bit about it. It could be because of the fact that neoliberalism also is about paying less tax. It's about it's not about sort of the richest should pay the highest taxes, sort of addressing inequality and some kind of redistribution. It's basically keep the tax burden as low as possible. But if that's the case, then it's really difficult to pay for a lot of things like education and healthcare and so on. So anyway, let's just go back to the slides and think a little bit more about what neoliberalism has done. And then maybe we can also think about what alternatives there might be. So I'm hoping you can see my slides there. And so here's an example actually from Greece, which you might find interesting. It's sort of similar to the Marshall Island example, but let's hear.
Is about growth-obsessed urbanism, which means the prioritization of economic growth over other types of objectives, such as sustainability or social welfare. In Athens, for example, in Greece, we see that the example of Ellinikon, which was the previous airport, the central airport of Greece, when it moved, it left a very large plot of land, mostly unused, and the promise was that this would be turned into a public, open, green park for the people of Athens, to also balance the lack of green that Athens is suffering. However, because of the crisis and because of the debt that Greece has to pay back, the idea that became most dominant and which got approved in the end was to actually have elite developments of housing, of five-star hotels, of a casino that is obviously not designed for the citizens of Athens, but rather for, elite players of the economy. And it's very obvious that there's the aspect of biodiversity, greening the city, offering space for healthy activity for the citizens was undermined by objectives of basically attracting money in the economy.
That's a very practical example. And there's actually a leading critical urban theory expert, David Harvey, who has made a lot of comments about the neoliberal city. And he points to three things that neoliberalism has done to our cities. Firstly, a lot of cities become identified as tourist destinations. And it's really about just experiencing and consuming those cities. A good example is of where this is getting quite extreme is Kyoto in Japan. And another example is Venice, where we see, for instance, Venice now they're thinking of having additional taxes and so on. And recently there was a big demonstration in the Canary Islands of people who are saying, well, we've got too much tourism. The next is cities must have a good, excuse me, a good business climate. There must be great places for businesses to set up and operate. I have a feeling that, Singapore fits into that category of being trying to present itself as having a really good business climate. And finally, cities are wonderful places for the super rich and corporations, but unaffordable for everybody else. It just reminds me of that movie Crazy Rich Asians, where a lot of the cities, if you're very wealthy, then you can really enjoy the urban living. But if you're not, then it's something of an uphill battle all the time. So those are three things that Harvey said happened as a result of neoliberalism. And there's quite a few other commentators who I think are really interesting. One is Mark Fisher, and he basically talks about how we are unable to see any alternative to capitalism. He calls it capitalist realism. And what he argues is that essentially neoliberalism has undermined how we understand value from an ethical point of view. Sadly, he's no longer with us. This comment actually from Peter Bloom is really interesting because what he says is that neoliberalism individualizes ethics. So we each become responsible for dealing with the moral and structural failings of neoliberalism. So for instance, neoliberalism doesn't want to tackle the climate problem. So therefore you are made to feel guilty for being responsible for your own carbon footprint and so on. And again, I think that people feel, for instance, that they need to do something to help the homeless by setting up food banks and things like that. It's where the individual has to essentially act in order to counter some of the very negative side effects of just focusing on economic growth and the private sector. And then Wendy Brown, and you'll be able to see my slides later if you want to look at these, but basically Wendy Brown is saying that neoliberalism has undermined our notion of what society is and what politics is all about, and it's really just focusing on individual freedom. So that's very much the case. I think it's very strong in the United States, but I think other cultures are following that path. So what should we do? What are the alternatives? Is it possible, for instance, to talk about shared values or collective communities, or even is it possible to think about redefining prosperity in some other way? And there's something called new municipalism, which I'd like to you to look at. There's an article on CLE for people to look in, but there is a reaction, and I just want to talk about that. I'll share a video about the reaction that we're seeing around the world to get you thinking.
For decades, our cities have been seen by the neoliberal elite as growth machines, battling one another to increase the financial figures that seemingly represent the success of their economy. Meanwhile, austerity is biting hard, with the lowest funding for local government since 1948. Inequality is at an all-time high, and basic services to meet the simplest of our needs are cracking under the pressure. But cities aren't just growth machines, they are engines of political renewal. In response to austerity, we've begun to see a global renaissance in urban politics under the banner of the new municipalism, or municipal socialism. Inspired by waves of revolt and insurgency, grassroots movements are again looking at how to seize the levers of power for emancipatory politics. There's no one model for this new municipalism, but they share some common concerns. The feminization of politics is not just about getting women into power. In Spain, citizen platform Barcelona en Comú got their representatives elected onto the city council and are now dismantling concentrated power and redistributing it. 30,000 citizens collectively ratified the platform's manifesto, placing care, cooperation, and people's lived experience at the heart of politics. Community wealth building is about retaking control of local services from big business. Through remunicipalization, recommoning, and supporting the development of local worker cooperatives, communities are stopping corporations from leeching wealth out of our towns and cities. Anchor institutions, those organizations rooted in place like hospitals and universities, can actively support progressive and democratic forms of economic development by changing the way they interact with their city, encouraging them, for example, to insource domiciliary workers and confer full employment rights to end casualization. The new municipalism is fundamentally about movement building and struggle, affirming cities as sites of resistance. Through new municipalist practices of governing, citizens are winning back power where they live. Together, cities committed to equality, democracy, and the feminization of politics are beginning to usher in a new era of global inter-urban solidarity with the aim of developing a transformative politics capable of looking beyond capitalism.
So I'm going to suggest we break up into groups again. And you've seen that there is this groundswell. There's this movement of communities and cities where they're trying to respond to things like, for instance, the decline of the high street, the fact that everybody's shopping online and stores are closing down, banks are closing down, and so on. And they're looking at different models. One of them is called community wealth building. And I just want you to think about this and whether you think there's any issues or problems with that. If there's any problems with putting emphasis on the community over individualism, or how do you think people will react to it? Or is this something that's feasible in your city? You know, those examples that I was showing there, a lot of them come from Europe and North America, but do you think they would work in, parts of Asia? So I'd just like you to have again, just let's go into our groups and have a discussion. I'll make breakout rooms again, and let's recreate them. So we're going to do 3 breakout rooms. Hang on, recreate. And let's try and assign, oh, hang on, I've got 2 there. Excuse me, recreate. So I want you to have a discussion about this collectivist response versus the individual responses. Is that okay? Is there any questions before you do that? Again, for 10 to 15 minutes. Can you imagine any kind of negative outcome as a result of shifting and trying to find another path? Is it all clear? Okay. So please, I'm going to open rooms. Please go into the rooms and have a discussion. Back. Sounded like you were having really good discussions there. And it's interesting when you start to think about, okay, there are these other pathways, but actually it's quite challenging to go down that direction. Again, could we get somebody just to report back? Okay, Yuri, please. Thank you for putting your hand up.
Our group talked about how, like in Japan, it's a very collectivistic culture but it seems like there's like one dominant culture and then the rest are all like marginalized and all that. So I feel like if there's like a greater emphasis on community over individualism, there's like the risk of like less diversity and all that. But also Ian talked about in Malta, there's like many smaller communities. And so I guess in a way that's like if you look at it from really far away, it's kind of like individuals and opinions, but it's like hard to gather all opinions together. So they end up having to kind of, in the end, kind of create one community or like culture or yeah. And so yeah, we're talking about how we think it'd be best if like people can like find a balance between community and individualism, but like I guess it's hard to find that balance.
Mm.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point to take away from today's class is how do we find that balance? It's not like we're going to be able to get rid of individualism, but maybe we need to kind of temper it a little bit somehow. Okay, other groups, please. Anybody going to report on the discussions? I'm waiting for a hand to go up. Or
I think we had a bit of a.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
But you can present because I'm not sure if they're gonna mute my voice. So yeah.
Okay.
I think we had a bit about, I guess, the issues of where the burden goes. So like who's going to resist or accept the introduction of a collectivist system. So people who currently profit or who have ideas that they could profit in the future from an American dream individualist type of scenario will be resistant to its introduction. And then you have the you know, different. We sort of discussed a bit about different countries taxing, you know, frameworks, and how, you know, if you're creating a collectivist system, then you have to consider who is carrying how much of the burden, and whether that should be like business taxing, income taxing, and that sort of thing. And then you have also sort of prejudicial issues as well, because some people have views based on thinking that they should have more rights because they are born in a place, or because they do A or B, or because, you know, and so that will all impact both the introduction and the smooth operation of any collectivist system that you might try to introduce.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really fantastic point. Yeah, we were talking, Yuri mentioned Japan as being kind of collectivist, but I also think Scandinavian countries are an interesting example to look at. And I think the reason I point to Scandinavian countries is because taxation is very high in those countries. But on the other hand, the kind of social security system and pension system and education system is also really good. So it's almost like a trade-off that you can make. But I think, Ruben, you're right. It's maybe in some places we've gone too far, that people sort of feel like, I don't feel why should I have to pay so much more money to improve the education of others? You know, so I feel like we do have in Japan and maybe, you know, Sweden and Norway examples to look at. But if you take UK and US, there's a big challenge to get them to move in a collectivist direction for the points that you've outlined. Was there anyone else from the third group want to mention anything? I'm not seeing anybody. Okay. Well, one of the I think actually what's really interesting right now is to look at I don't know if you follow well, probably you don't, but the elections that are happening in London now for the mayor are very, very interesting, because one of the things that there seems to be happening is it's one of this sort of individualist versus collectivist battle. So they have something which is called ultra low emission zones, and that people who are driving cars of a certain age are encouraged to buy a car that is actually with lower emissions. So lots of people are complaining, saying you're impinging on my individual right to choose what kind of vehicle I want to drive. And then they are also worried about this notion of a 15-minute city. I don't know if you've come across it, but there's now this sort of conspiracy theory that rather than having the 15-minute city as being somewhere that's super convenient and having all the services close by in 15 minutes, they're actually worried that you'll be confined to 15 minutes. That's as far as you can travel around your home. I guess that connects into the whole lockdown idea. But then they're also saying, well, the next thing is you're going to force us to buy electric vehicles or do car sharing, further impinging on our individual rights. So there's a whole group who are trying to get the current mayor voted out and have a new mayor come in who's going to get rid of all these requirements there. And it's a little bit like, well, I, as an individual, have a right to a car. I have an individual, have a right to travel around as much as I want. And I don't need, you can't force me to think about a green vehicle. And I certainly won't think about the climate, versus the other argument, which is that we do have to collectively address the climate. We have to try to reduce air pollution. Maybe we should invest in public transport and so on. So it's a really individual versus collectivist battle going on. Okay, I'll have just a few quick slides to share with you before we finish. But I'm glad you had the chance to sort of reflect on the downside of collectivist responses. And I don't know exactly how we're going to navigate all of this, but one good example is to look at Los Angeles. And there's a really good article which I've shared on CLE about how many different communities from different ethnic backgrounds have been negotiating in that city to create what this Michael Ignatieff describes as a moral operating system. And it is difficult. And it does require people to develop this shared moral code, but it also means that you have to deal with different value systems and so on. It's going to be time consuming, and it's going to be a constant thing that you need to do when you live in a multicultural context. Japan isn't as multicultural as the United States and parts of Europe, so it's not really encountering these major issues, but we're seeing it more and more in different cities around the world about trying to figure out a way that these communities can live in peace or a certain degree of harmony. There's also been a lot written about possible directions. So, for instance, I would recommend Bregman's book on Utopia for Realists. Tim Jackson talks about post-growth capitalism. And there's also Aaron Bastani's book on fully automated luxury communism. He's basically arguing that we should just accept all the technology innovations that are happening, but we should use it to make people feel quality of life better, a job security better, and so on. But here's a whole list of things that we might be expected to see in this collectivist response. So like emancipatory politics, more experimentation with how democracy works, networking in the city level, low carbon, and then also trying to address inequality and poverty, high ecological consciousness, and feminization of the state and corporate culture. Bit of a long shopping list. Hard to imagine how it's all going to work, but these are directions that people are saying that we need to go in. There's also the article on new municipalism on the CLE, so take a look at that and see what you think. It's kind of like trying to reinvent how cities function, to have notions of civic pride, to have a stronger, more diverse forms of local government and more freedom at the local level. So not so much dictated by central government needs, but more by what the city needs. And then finally, just to remind you about the individual presentation, it's a 5-minute narrated presentation. I've put some examples about how you might make a PowerPoint, a narrated PowerPoint on the CLE. So please take a look at that. And there's a whole list of potential ethical solutions that you might want to look at. If you do choose an ethical solution, please explain what it is that's ethical about that solution and why you selected it and how you think it might work. So with that, I'm at the end of the class. There's a couple of extra slides there about how neoliberalism and ethical urban planning are different, and I'll just suggest you take a look at those online. So I'm going to stop sharing. Is there any questions before I finish? It's exactly on time. All good? Well, I hope you enjoyed the chance to interact with your peers. Sometimes it's quite difficult with different setups, and I saw people were outside of classroom and didn't have a good microphone and so on. But I hope you found the discussions interesting. And as I said, the next week's lecture will be Professor John Fain on Right to the City. Okay, well, thank you very much. Have a nice, oh yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the attendance. Is the attendance already checked with us being in that call, or do we have to do something?
I've basically just taken a screenshot of your participant list here.
All right,
I will be able to do that. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else got any questions? Okay, so enjoy, for those in Japan, enjoy the Golden Week break, and everybody else will see you next week.